Okay, let's do this. So today I want to talk about Korea. And I say Korea because I mean not just South Korea and not just North Korea. We're going to talk about both. And we're going to take a step back, try and understand Korea and why it's important for us today. Now, we're hearing the reports that have just come out about the results of the South Korean election. So that's kind of the occasion that has made me decide to do this video. But we're also going to step back. We're going to talk about how Korea has come to be the way that it is now, and we're going to talk about why that is important. What does that mean for us now, regionally, worldwide, and what does it mean going forward? And in order to kind of frame the discussion, I'll start by saying there are a lot of people who believe that North Korea is a massive threat, both to South Korea and then also to the United States, right? And even its neighbors. Japan considers North Korea a threat. So there's kind of this immediate, potentially existential threat to South Korea. That's what we're led to believe. And I'm not saying that's wrong. There is this regional threat. So North Korea's the danger that it presents to its neighbors. We know that it, you know, conducts missile tests all the time. Japan considers North Korea to certainly be a threat. And at times, the United States has also considered that North Korea represents some form of threat, to some degree. So, but what exactly does that mean? What does that mean for us? What happened a couple of years ago with some of the rhetoric that we were hearing during Trump's first administration? So we're gonna kind of talk about that. But before we take a step back, let's kind of talk about where we are right now with the election results that have just come out in South Korea. And maybe you haven't even heard about this right now. And it's not necessarily creating a bunch of waves in the United States because a lot of people are maybe not necessarily focused on who the next president of South Korea is going to be. But what I'm saying is, hey, let's pay a little bit of attention to this. South Korea is a critical country. The United States considers South Korea to be a big ally. Now, you guys know that I don't always necessarily talk within the typical geopolitical narrative that most people frame their discussions within. But that doesn't necessarily mean that South Korea is not important. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't pay attention to Korea. Right now, there are a lot of escalations between the East and the West. And so if tensions continue to mount between the East and the West, it's going to be important that we pay attention to Korea, both North and South. So with that said, I'm going to read part of an article today that comes from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And so it looks like this article is, it just came out today, so June 3rd, 2025. And it looks like it has been authored by Victor Cha and Andy Lim. Now, some of you may recognize that name, Victor Cha, but if you don't, Victor Cha had actually been initially named, if I recall correctly, initially named as the ambassador to South Korea in late 2017. And then immediately after having been nominated, his name was withdrawn because there was some tensions between a statement that he had made and President Trump. So basically in mid to late 2017, there was a lot of this rhetoric going on between Kim Jong-un and President Trump. Incidentally, this is the time in which I arrived to Korea. So I spent nearly 3 years in Korea as a military officer. I was there from 2017 to 2020. And I got to Korea in early September of 2017. And this was kind of as this rhetoric was being launched back and forth. I mean, there was the fire and fury comment. There was there was the constant use of the term, little rocket man, but there was my red button is bigger than yours and it actually works. I mean, this is kind of some of the rhetoric that was being tossed back and forth between the summer kind of into the fall of 2017. And this was occurring as I arrived to South Korea. So, I was a major in the Army then. And as I got there, one of the first things that struck me as odd is, hey, all of this is going on. South Korea is supposedly a key ally of ours, not just in the region, but just considered to be a huge ally of ours, across the world. And yet we have no ambassador here. I thought that was super odd. Well, shortly after I arrive, an ambassador is named. That was Victor Cha. And then as soon as he is named, his name gets pulled by Trump. So basically, Trump says, yeah, I'm not actually going to give him the job. And the reason was because supposedly Victor Cha had criticized some of the remarks that President Trump had made about supposedly giving North Korea a bloody nose. Do you guys remember this rhetoric? So basically he was saying, hey, we do not want to even entertain some sort of option as like a preemptive strike on North Korea or some sort of limited bloody nose strike. Okay. That's going to be problematic, that you can't engage in that type of tit for tat with North Korea. So these are some of the things that Victor Cha was saying is, hey, you don't want to pursue this with North Korea, and President Trump then, kind of withdrew his nomination as the ambassador. Victor Cha, and I'm not here to tell you that I'm taking Victor Cha's side or whatever. I'm sure that Victor Cha is a major globalist. I mean, he comes out of Georgetown, and now he has some role with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. But I do recognize his name. And right now, the only reason I'm bringing this article up, which I will link in the description below, is because I just want us to get a handle on what has happened with the election and what are prominent voices in the United States saying with respect to these election results. That's all we're trying to figure out right now. We're not necessarily trying to get super analytical at the moment. So I'm actually not concerned at all that we're looking at what Victor Cha says. And in fact, I think he's a good place to start. So this comes out today. This article is from CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies.org, CSIS.org. I'll put the link down below. And the article is South Korea's new president, frying pan to fire. So Lee Jae-myung of the Democratic Party of Korea secured a landslide victory in the 21st South Korean presidential election on June 3rd. With 49.42% of the vote and a 79.38% voter turnout, the highest since 1997, Lee comes into office with a solid popular mandate and comfortable control of the National Assembly, something his predecessor never had. Okay, so who just got elected? Lee Jae-myung of the Democratic Party of Korea. Landslide victory. Question: what happened in today's election? Answer: after a frenetic 60-day election campaign, South Koreans may hope that today's result marks the beginning of a long-awaited normalization for the country, which has endured a 6-month constitutional and political crisis stemming from former President Yoon Suk-yeol's short-lived imposition of martial law and subsequent impeachment. The election outcome was largely expected for Lee, who never lost his lead as the front runner, while the former ruling People Power Party failed to coalesce around a single candidate and overcome the stigma of being the party of the man who plunged the country into crisis. Okay, what happened? The former president, 6 months ago, implemented martial law. Okay, this happened in December, if I recall. So December of last year, so 6 months ago. President Yoon. He was subsequently impeached. So there's been what they're referring to as a snap election. So they had to have a quick election because the former president had been impeached. This president, President Lee, or this gentleman, Mr. Lee, has now just been elected and will become the new president, President Lee. The victory today marks a tremendous political comeback for Lee, who narrowly lost the previous presidential election by a mere 0.7% to the now disgraced Yoon. All right. Let's see. What are we going to say here? Furthermore, Lee's win today brings back to office progressive political forces in South Korea that were last in office in 2022 under President Moon Jae-in 2 years earlier than expected. Okay, so here's what happens. In Korea, in South Korea, you serve a single 5-year term. So what they mean is that President Yoon should have been in office from 2022 until 2027. And now, because he was impeached, you're getting a new president 2 years early. Lee takes office on June 4th. That's tomorrow. And I mean, it's already June 4th right now in South Korea. Lee takes office on June 4th with no transition period due to the unique nature of this snap election, and will immediately have to tackle an unenviable backlog of domestic and foreign policy challenges. In this sense, the election closed the impeachment chapter, but opens a new and even more challenging one. Question 2. Who is Lee Jae-myung? Answer. Lee Jae-myung is the leader of the Progressive Democratic Party of Korea, a former National Assemblyman and 2-time presidential candidate. Okay. All right. Great. So what you're seeing here is the way this is kind of written is, so the two authors, Victor Cha, Andy Lim, so they're kind of writing this in an answered question format, which is good, because I will link this below and you can go through and read this. And if you don't know anything about South Korea, this will at least kind of get you up to speed, right? With at least kind of the generalities of what you need to know about what's happening. Question 3, and I am skipping some of this. What challenges await the new president? Answer. Lee arguably faces the most daunting challenges of any South Korean president since Kim Dae-jung was elected to office in the midst of Korea's liquidity crisis in 1997. In South Korea's 2 previous impeachment crises, 2004 and 2017, recovery from the economic downturns relied on China's economic boom in 2004 and the South Korean semiconductor export boom in 2017. But no such favorable factors exist today. On the contrary, what Lee must deal with is a markedly less forgiving external environment, war in Ukraine and Gaza, U.S. tariffs, Chinese export controls, and North Korea/Russia relations, all of which work against South Korea's economic recovery. Question 4, what will the priority be for the next Korean president? South Korea, it actually says South Korean government. Sorry, I can't read. The economy will be the top priority for Lee. All right, so we got it. All right. I'm going to skip some of this. I like how succinctly they stated that. Question 5, what are Lee's views on major foreign policy issues? Great question. Answer. On relations with the United States, Lee has refashioned himself into a staunch supporter of the alliance, calling it the foundation of South Korean diplomacy. The two leaders will probably have their first meeting on the sidelines of the G7 summit meeting in Alberta later this month. There will be much to discuss: tariffs, potential troop withdrawals. Remember that. What that's a reference to is all the U.S. troops, of which I used to be one, that are stationed in Korea. So there will be much to discuss: tariffs, potential troop withdrawals, and North Korea policy. All right. On North Korea, Lee has called for dialogue and cooperation with Pyongyang, but has acknowledged that an immediate inter-Korean summit is infeasible. So he's not looking to meet anytime soon with the North Korean leader. Lee has also promised to reinstate the 2018 Inter-Korean Military Agreement, restore inter-Korean hotlines, and halt leaflet campaigns toward North Korea. Trump will likely re-engage with North Korea at some point, but could bypass Seoul in negotiating directly with the North Korean leader. We're going to talk about all of this. What is the 2018 Inter-Korean Military Agreement? What does this mean? Restore inter-Korean hotlines. Okay, what exactly does that mean? On China, Lee has called for a pragmatic, balanced approach and expressed willingness to stabilize and manage ties, underscoring China's geographic and economic importance. Such policies could clash with the Trump administration, which has made clear that allies cannot expect to hedge between the United States and China by maintaining economic ties with the latter and defense ties with the former. Okay, there are people in the United States that are not happy about this election of now President Lee in South Korea, and they think that this is going to be problematic for bilateral U.S. South Korea relations. So again, I don't pretend to know that much at all about this gentleman, now President Lee, and I'm not even an expert on Korean politics. I'm just a guy who's interested. I'm a guy who spent some time over there. I'm not one of these guys who is a Korea watcher that constantly is kind of fixated on the news that comes out of Korea. But I am interested, and I feel like I have some context that I can look at this issue through or from, but also share some insights with you guys that may help you see this a little bit more clearly or a little bit more broadly, or just maybe give you an enlarged perspective to approach it from. Okay. And then there's also a paragraph here that just talks about Japan. On Japan, Lee has given interviews this year in which he has acknowledged the importance of trilateralism and strong Korea-Japan relations, and disavowed any concerns that his presidency would reverse Yoon's, that's the previous president, Yoon's reconciliation efforts with Japan and the Camp David process. This position will resonate with the Trump administration. Okay, so I will link this below. You guys can look at this, and you guys can figure out what you think. Now, let's talk about, there's something else I'm going to read that I think you guys are going to find interesting. I'm going to tell you something you probably didn't know about Korea. I'd be really surprised if you did. And if you did, then great, but I doubt you did. And I'm going to talk about why this is important. So when we talk about geopolitics, and you guys know that I don't subscribe to kind of what I call, and I've made a previous video about this, you guys know that I don't subscribe to the geopolitics 101 narrative or the history 101 narrative. I think things are more conspiratorial, okay? And keep that in mind as we go through what we're going to talk about today, because that's not exactly what we're going to talk about today, but I want you to keep that in mind, because of course that's the way that I approach these problems. But that doesn't mean that you always have to completely ignore what's happening in the news, okay? I don't really look at mainstream media that much at all, unless I'm going to just get a snapshot of something that happened, without necessarily any like editorialization about it or whatever, because that's the stuff that I don't trust, unless I just want to know, well, what is the narrative that is being promoted to the American public or to the global public about A, B, or C? Because sometimes it is important to know that too, right? And that's kind of the spirit in which I was just reading what we just read from Victor Cha and Andy Lim, is just kind of like, okay, these people who are intimately familiar with South Korea, even if they're looking at it through a very globalist mindset, what are they saying and what are they immediately communicating? And that article came out today. All right, so just some things to keep in mind. When we think about geostrategically, what are some of the flashpoints that people constantly call attention to that could be used as a trigger for World War III? Like we hear that a lot. And right now, tensions are heating up all over the world. I made a video, as you guys well know, because I keep referring back to it, but I made a video before President Trump came into office in which I said, hey, here's what I think we can expect in 2025. And I boiled it down to about two things. One, war, and two, the digital control grid or increased technocracy. And I have since said, oh, by the way, I think those are kind of two sides of the same coin. The preparation or the escalation of tensions abroad, potentially followed by war abroad, can be accompanied by increased technocracy here at home. And that is what I think is happening. Okay. Korea. when people talk about these potential geostrategic flashpoints, there are a couple that people always mention. And one is, of course, the Korean Peninsula. Why? You got this country that we have a strong alliance with, that's South Korea, which is supposedly being threatened daily by, North Korea, which of course has nuclear weapons, according to what we're told, and therefore represents a threat to its immediate neighbor on the same peninsula, but also regionally and also to the United States, et cetera. And then it's further aligned with China. It's aligned with Russia. You guys get the picture. Well, what are some other geostrategic flashpoints that we hear about? Well, what was happening 2 weeks ago? Well, 2 weeks ago, the whole world was watching what was happening between India and Pakistan, which again has been one of those geostrategic flashpoints that people have called attention to, for a long time. Like, oh, what's going on in Kashmir? What's going on with these constant tensions between these two nuclear powers, Pakistan and India? So that's another. Obviously, Taiwan has been one. What's going to happen with Taiwan? And then over the last couple of years, another one has been Ukraine. Like, what's happening between Russia and Ukraine? We know there are these heightened tensions between Russia and the West. How is NATO involved? What's exactly happening between the escalations with Russia and NATO, etc. So my point in sharing that is there are people who have been saying one of these flashpoints, either organically or in a manufactured way, could be the spark that results in World War III. And in fact, I'll tell you, a guy that I used to read quite a bit. I haven't really read him at all in the last couple of years, but I used to read his material quite a bit, is the analyst Joel Skousen. So whatever you think about Joel Skousen or whatever, not necessarily my point, but I used to read him quite a bit for years, but I haven't in a couple of years at all. But he was one of these guys who would say that he felt that the globalists had preserved North Korea as a potential trigger to be used for World War III. That, Western powers, they'll go into Afghanistan, they'll go into Iraq, but they won't go into a country that is, by all accounts, far, far, far worse. North Korea. Why? Oh, well, because, nuclear weapons, and they'll nuke Seoul, or they're at least, fire a bunch of, whatever. That's kind of, that's what we've been told as to why we could not invade North Korea. Now, maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. Not necessarily my point. But what Joel Skousen would say is, there's a reason why North Korea has been preserved as the potential for World War III, because if North Korea then does something that causes this spark for World War III that the globalists want, it's easy to blame, because you can just say, hey, nobody who could have predicted this, Kim Jong-un is crazy anyway. So anyway, I hope I'm not putting too many words there in Joel Skousen's mouth. I think that is largely kind of what his idea was towards why North Korea could potentially serve as a trigger for World War III. And I'm not saying that I agree or disagree with that. I think that's an interesting assessment. Something's clearly going on with North Korea, but regardless of whether we do or do not agree with that idea as North Korea potentially being a trigger that could cause World War III, either totally organically without having been, planned or kind of manufactured by anybody, or because it was specifically engineered to occur. Regardless, I think that we can still appreciate the fact that North Korea is we do have to pay attention to North Korea. I'll go back to my initial idea here in creating this video, which is kind of heads up, eyes on what's happening in Korea. Yes, we've got these elections. I think we should pay attention to that. But more broadly than just these South Korean elections, I think we need to look at what's going to be happening on the Korean Peninsula in the coming weeks and months, potentially as tensions continue to escalate between the East and the West. And what I mean is that could be in the East, that could be China, that could be Russia, Iran, but North Korea has a strong relationship with all those countries. So let's talk a little bit about how Korea came to be the way that it is. We're gonna jump through history very, very, very rapidly. But have you ever asked yourself the question, well, why are there two Koreas and how long have there been two Koreas? Well, the answer to that question is not very long. So Korea, the whole peninsula, one people, the Korean people, has been around for thousands of years. That's what Koreans would tell you. So what happened? So over a period of a long, long time, Korea would be invaded by the Japanese, by the Chinese, and Korea was controlled by a series of dynasties. And then that all ended in 1910 with what has come to be known as the occupation of Japan. So Japan fully annexed Korea in 1910 and basically made it a colony. So it held Korea as a colony from 1910 up through World War II until the conclusion of World War II, which of course was brought about by the surrender of Japan. So when that happened in the summer of 1945, the Allies took control of the Korean peninsula in order to kind of facilitate the surrender of Japanese troops that were on the Korean peninsula, and then ensure their withdrawal from Korea, back to Japan. So this is in the summer of 1945 at the conclusion of the war. So when I say the Allies, I'm talking about two main allies, and that's the Soviet Union and the United States. So in order to facilitate the surrender and withdrawal of Japanese troops from the Korean peninsula, what they did was they basically said, hey, Soviet Union, you take the northern half of Korea. United States, you take the southern half of Korea. And they drew this line at the 38th parallel. Now, you've probably heard that term, the 38th parallel, but that's how that kind of initial division between the two Koreas happened. And it was meant to be administrative, and it was meant to facilitate this orderly withdrawal of the Japanese troops, etc. And then there was this idea that, okay, we've liberated Korea from the Japanese. Once the Koreans are ready to self-govern, the Korea Peninsula will be turned over to them. Now, some of you are probably like, was there ever an intent to really turn it back over to the Koreans? Listen, I wasn't there. I'm not necessarily going to tell you one way or the other. I'm also not going to tell you, like, how much say did the Koreans have in this? Because here's the deal. If you say to me, hey, that sounds a lot like what happened with Germany, you'd be correct. So we divided Germany, east and west, and what happens? Well, the east becomes aligned with who? The Soviet Union, and the west with the West, the United States, but also UK, etc. Well, what happened with Korea? Well, same thing, right? So the next thing you know, the northern half of the Korean peninsula becomes super aligned, kind of administratively controlled by the Soviet Union, and the same thing with the southern half of the peninsula with the United States. And in fact, the Soviet Union installs a leader that is friendly to them, obviously, to control North Korea. And that, of course, is Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung was the father of Kim Jong-il, who later would take over North Korea after Kim Il-sung's death. And then Kim Jong-il had, one of his sons was Kim Jong-un, who, of course, leads North Korea today. So that's the Kim dynasty. In South Korea, you had Syngman Rhee, who was the first one in charge of South Korea. And then shortly after this formalized division into North and South Korea, well, what happens? Well, now you have a war. So now you have a war in 1950. There are differing opinions on exactly how that happened. But the normal narrative that we in the West hold to is, North Korea invaded. There is a North Korean side of what happened there. I'm not necessarily telling you that's true or whatever, but anyway, there's a war. We in the West, the narrative holds that North Korea invaded. I have read some people who question that a bit, but anyway, that's not necessarily my point for this video today. But anyway, So North Korea invades, and the United States declares war on North Korea. But what else happens? Well, the United Nations gets involved. So this is 1950. This is just a couple of years after the conclusion of World War II. And what's really interesting, you may not necessarily know this, is that the United Nations got involved in the Korean War, not as some sort of third party arbiter between the two belligerents, but as a belligerent. And so the United Nations served as the multinational umbrella under which all of these nations would fall in order to support South Korea in repelling the North Korean invasion. That means that the United Nations was a belligerent on one side of the war and remains so to this day. Because why? Because to this day, in 2025, the war has not formally ended. So what happened? So in June of 1950, the war starts, right? So a year later, the two sides enter into negotiations. But it would take 2 years of negotiations for them to agree on terms that would allow an armistice to be drafted and signed. And that armistice was signed in July of 1953. So the hostilities lasted for 3 years, and then the hostilities were brought to a cessation through the signing of this armistice. So what is an armistice? An armistice is a formal ceasefire. Is an armistice a peace treaty? No. An armistice is a formal ceasefire that is signed by military commanders. So the military commanders on both sides. So typically that would be generals. A peace treaty is one step up because a peace treaty is now signed by political leaders, like typically heads of state. So an armistice could be done as a bridging solution to stop the hostilities and kind of pave the way for an eventual peace treaty. And what happened with the Korean War is we never got from the armistice to the peace treaty. That was in 1953. And here we are in 2025. We're still under the armistice and we still haven't gotten to the peace treaty. So if you remember, in 2018, there was talk about President Trump and Kim Jong-un ending the Korean War. And the astute observer might ask two questions. One, well, like, wait, is the war still going on? And the answer to that question is yes. And then two, well, who exactly can end the war? Can North Korea and South Korea end the war? Does it require the United States or what? So this is where it gets super tricky. The armistice was signed by General Mark Clark, who was a United States Army general, and he signed on behalf of United Nations Command, which means he signed on behalf of all of the troops from all these various nations that were fighting under the United Nations Command banner, to include South Korea. So the war it's not exactly between North Korea and South Korea as much as it was between North Korea, also assisted by China, specifically the Chinese People's Volunteers, the CPV volunteers, I'm sure, and the United Nations Command, which was this umbrella command that consisted of combatants from many nations, one of which was the United States, but another of which was South Korea and many other nations. Well, who was considered to be in charge of or to hold kind of executive control of the United Nations Command? It was the United States. So the general, in this case, Mark Clark, it had been MacArthur. Okay. So MacArthur was the commander for about the first year. Then it was Ridgway. Then it was Mark Clark. So Mark Clark is in command, not just of U.S. forces, but also United Nations Command forces at the time that the armistice is signed. So what does that mean? It means that the armistice is kind of administrated still to this day between, North Korea and also kind of the United Nations Command. It gets really, really tricky, and it's kind of complex and can even be a little bit hard to follow. But technically, the war has not ended. That's why there could be discussions in 2018 about whether or not there could just be a peace treaty. Hey, wouldn't this be a great step forward if there could just be a peace treaty? Wouldn't that be a great monument to this warming of relations that is happening, not just between North Korea and South Korea, but potentially even North Korea and the United States as the executive agent of United Nations Command? Now, again, whether all that was kind of scripted or whether that was all just for show, I mean, we can quibble back and forth about that. That's not necessarily my point. I'm just giving you some insight or some context into what exactly happened back in the early 50s, what is happening now, and what some of these discussions were that were happening in 2018. So, with that said, if you're still with me, and if you're not, you should be, we're going to read something else that I think you guys are going to find really interesting. I would hope that you would find this pretty interesting. And I'm going to read this. This was written by a friend of mine who's a really good dude. And I think this is super well written. And I'm going to share this with you guys. I'm going to give you the link after this. I really want you guys to go write this, because this is whatever we think about what's going on in Korea. And I'll be the first one to tell you, I don't know. I don't know what the truth about North Korea is. I spent 3 years in South Korea. I had some interesting and insightful positions while I was there in Korea that I'll talk about in just a moment. I don't pretend to know exactly what's going on in North Korea, but and when I say pretend to tell you exactly what's going on, I mean like the ground truth, like what's really going on. I don't necessarily know. But I do want to tell you about some things that you're probably not aware of when it comes to Korea, which may give you some insights into what was happening about the time that President Trump was going to go over there and visit. But also, there's a great human story here that I'm going to share with you that was written by my buddy Sean. I actually did not know that he had written this piece. I found this today. So I was looking around for some things. I wanted to talk a little bit about this election in South Korea, and I stumbled across this, and I'm like, oh, that was written by Sean. And I know Sean. I worked with Sean twice during my military career. He was a couple years ahead of me. He's a West Pointer. He graduated West Point a couple years ahead of me. And then we worked together when we were both in the 10th Mountain Division. And he was the brigade executive officer, and I was an officer on the brigade staff. And then later I would go be an S3 or an operations officer in one of the battalions within the brigade while he was the brigade executive officer, which is so the brigade executive officer, like that's a distinguished position, because you're by position, you are you're the senior most major in the brigade. And it's you're also the chief of staff or the brigade commander's staff. And you got to have the right guy in that job. And Sean Morrow was the great guy. Now, incidentally, like 2 years later, I would be the brigade executive officer. And when I was the brigade executive officer, in some ways, I could kind of look back and say, you know what? I remember when Sean was the brigade XO, executive officer. He did this or he said this, and I could kind of model what I was going to do, or at least the way that I should think on Sean Morrow. And so if that's not good praise, then I don't know what is. But fast forward. So after I left Fort Drum, so I would end up in Korea. So Fort Drum is where 10th Mountain Division is. I would end up in Korea. And like a year after I got to Korea, Sean ends up there. And so he was the battalion commander. So he was a lieutenant colonel. I was a major at this point. So we'd been majors together, but he was a couple years ahead of me. And so I'm now like a senior major, and he is a lieutenant colonel who had actually gone to get a PhD for a couple years, and now was a battalion commander for a really important and like a super unique battalion in South Korea up on the DMZ. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment. But not only was he the battalion commander for this super unique position, but he was there at a critical time. And there's not a better guy you could have had there than Sean Morrow. First of all, he's a smart guy, but he's a good dude. Like, I just trust him. Like, he's a guy that I think cares. I think he cares about doing the right thing. And he's a diplomatic person. So the right guy at the right time for such a critical position. So let's read this, because I think this is going to be eye-opening for many of you, and I think that you will also just find it interesting. Okay, so this is a piece called Bridges at Panmunjom. And I'm wondering if I should just share this with you guys. I don't know if anybody actually watches these videos, or if you all just listen. I don't know. But there are some cool pictures here. So maybe I'll just share this as I read. You guys can, if you want to follow along, you can also look at the some of these like really cool pictures. Let me do that. So okay. All right. So I will give you guys the link, but this is from the Wilson Quarterly. I'm not exactly familiar with that publication, but it's written by Lieutenant Colonel Sean Morrow. Now, he is now a colonel. I think he's still in the military. I don't know for sure, but I don't know if he's retired yet, but he's a colonel. But this was written in the summer of 2020. So this piece is 5 years old. But he's writing it basically as he was leaving battalion command, or right after he left battalion command. He was in battalion command up in South Korea, up along the DMZ from 2018 to 2020. And I was in Korea from 2017 to 2020. So those last 2 years, we would have been there together. And we interacted quite a bit kind of that first year that he was in command. Okay. Bridges at Panmunjom. The former commander of the United Nations Command Security Battalion, Joint Security Area. So that's a really long name, but that is the name of his battalion. We would all just call it the Security Battalion. The Security Battalion up there in the Joint Security Area of the DMZ. All right, so the former commander of the United Nations Command Security Battalion dash Joint Security Area in Korea's DMZ reflects on the past and present at the world's loneliest outpost. Okay, cool. What is the DMZ? All right, so the armistice is signed in July of 1953. As part of the armistice, what they do to ensure that the hostilities don't, recommence, is they create a buffer zone between the two sides. All right. And that buffer zone was about 2.5 miles or 4 kilometers, 4 kilometers between the two sides. So there's 4 kilometers of separation. And there was a swath, 4 kilometers wide. There was a swath that was drawn across the entire peninsula, which is about 150 miles. So the DMZ cuts all the way across the entire Korean peninsula. And it was this 4-kilometer buffer zone to keep some distance between the two sides. We're gonna separate the two sides. And it was demilitarized because we're gonna separate the sides so they can kind of remove personnel, and weaponry was the big thing. From that buffer zone, that DMZ still exists. Now, most people, if they know anything about the DMZ at all, they think of, the line, and you can see the North Korean troops, and there are the little blue buildings right there. If that image comes to your mind at all, either because you've been there, because you can go there and you can tour, or because you've seen pictures of it, or you've seen mock-ups on it, for various movies maybe, or whatever, that is a specific area of the DMZ known as the JSA, the Joint Security Area. It is by far what people think of when they think of the DMZ. It is the most prominent part of the DMZ by far, but that is not the entirety of the DMZ. The DMZ is 150 miles long. It is far more than just that tiny little, though very, very important area known as the JSA. The security battalion that Sean Morrow was the commander for would provide security in that joint security area. Okay. All right. So now that we have that out of the way, let's read a little bit. So bridges at Panmunjom. All right, Sean Morrow. I am not a civil engineer. I am an infantryman. However, over 2 years leading the combined battalion, I learned a lot about bridges. Combined. Why combined? Because the battalion that he commanded had U.S. soldiers and also South Korean soldiers. And if I remember correctly, the deputy commander of that specific battalion would be a South Korean lieutenant colonel. Bridges are central to the geography and the psyche of the United Nations Command Security Battalion - Joint Security Area, the JSA. You must cross a bridge to get to the southern boundary of the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, where the soldiers of the security battalion live and work. You travel along Old Highway 1, which once connected the southern tip of Korea across the peninsula to the border with China. As you approach Panmunjom, you cross the Imjin River over the Tongil Bridge. And it's been a while since I've used these names, but like now that I used to use all these names on a daily basis. Only South Korean citizens with special government permission may access the restricted area north of the Imjin. Eventually, the highway unwinds to Camp Boniface, a place surrounded by rice fields and the home of the security battalion. Okay, so what's he talking about here? So he's talking about there used to be this old Highway 1, which basically ran north-south, so it would run the entire length of the peninsula, you know? And as you would get towards Panmunjom, which is like right before you get to the DMZ, like the split with, North Korea, that's what he's talking about. So there's the Imjin River, there's the Tongil Bridge, and that is the home of the security battalion. The joint security area is a small space near the original tavern town of Nomunri, where the armistice agreement was negotiated during 158 formal meetings and more than 500 working level and informal meetings before finally signing an agreement on July 27, 1953. The combined U.S. and Republic of Korea infantry battalion that constitutes the security battalion has protected diplomacy in Panmunjom since May 5th, 1952, even before the 1953 armistice. Signers of that 1953 armistice could hardly have imagined that it would be a lasting agreement. The ceasefire was supposed to last only a few months to get all sides to agree on a peace treaty. But the armistice agreement has become an enduring document holding strong for 67 years under the leadership of the United Nations Command. That was 67 years from 1953 to 2020. This piece was written 5 years ago. And the JSA, it also serves as a bridge, a crossing on the border that has remained open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as a place where generals and diplomats could come to one day negotiate the terms of peace. All right, so let's stop right there. So whatever you think about Korea, North Korea, whatever you think about narratives of history, just think about the people that are involved here. Whether you are a U.S. soldier that is part of this battalion up there, or that was in the organization that I was working with, which would work very, very closely with the security battalion. That's why, I know exactly what he's talking about, even though I wasn't in his specific battalion. I was in an organization on the general staff that would work extremely closely with this battalion. So it resonates with me. But if you were a U.S. soldier in Korea, maybe you spent time in the DMZ, or whether you are South Korean or even North Korean, if you just look at this through the lens of just, kind of the human dimension, or you're one of these civilians that lives in the area, because we're going to talk about that here in a moment, this is impactful. This stuff matters. And which is one of the reasons why I feel like we have to understand true history, and we have to understand that there are powerful people and networks that want to steal our rights and freedom away from us. It's important that we know that, but we can never forget the human dimension. You know, our decisions create impacts on very real human beings, whether they're American, whether they're South Korean, whether they're North Korean, you know? All right. Camp Boniface is not the end of the journey. To get to our place of duty inside the joint security area, we enter the DMZ itself and continue north on Highway 1. So as you were traveling north, and I did this many times, you travel north, you get to Camp Boniface. Camp Boniface is just outside the DMZ. But you got to keep going north and get into the DMZ, and that's kind of what he's talking about. The last 2 kilometers to Panmunjom take us past the small bridges leading to the fields and homes of the farmers of Daesungdong village. Daesungdong is the only village on the southern side of the border in the entire DMZ. Here, 200 residents who all trace their family heritage to the Panmun Valley back before the Korean War began live here. They abide by a strict set of regulations and security protocols as they farm land that directly adjoins North Korean rice fields. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK or North Korea, is also authorized to maintain one village in the demilitarized zone, Kijongdong, which is the sister city to Daesungdong. All right, stop right there. What is our friend Sean telling us? In the DMZ, okay? Now the DMZ, remember, 4-kilometer wide, you know, north to south, swath of land, 150 miles long, all the way across the peninsula. We're talking about the joint security area, so kind of that part that is the most important part. It's kind of the most prominent part of the DMZ. You could call it the center of the DMZ, but it's not exactly the center east to west, but it is kind of the center in between Seoul, the capital of South Korea, and Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea. Because from Seoul, you kind of go directly north and you would hit the JSA and the DMZ, and from Pyongyang, you'd kind of come south and you would hit that part of the JSA, and it is right where the armistice locations took place. So in that regard, you could kind of refer to it as the center of the DMZ. But if you're looking at the peninsula, it's not the geographic center east to west. It's further west. All right, but there are 2 villages in the DMZ. On the southern side of the DMZ, there is Daesungdong. On the northern side, the North Koreans also have a village in the DMZ that is Kijongdong. Okay, and what he's saying about Daesungdong is the people who live there can directly tie their ancestry is directly tied to villagers that lived there at the time that the armistice was signed, right? So that's what, or, you know, before the war. Now, so let me make a comment about the DMZ. So the DMZ, 4 kilometers north to south. So there is a line drawn through the exact middle. That line is called the MDL, Military Demarcation Line. From the MDL north 2 kilometers, that is the northern half of the DMZ. That is the DMZ that belongs to North Korea. From the MDL south 2 kilometers, that is the southern half of the DMZ. That part of the DMZ is controlled by, you guessed it, South Korea. No, wrong. The United Nations Command. Okay. This is important to remember. Okay. And this becomes it can kind of become there's a little bit of a conflict here between the United Nations Command and South Korea. And I mean, it's obvious because, I mean, there could be some sovereignty questions here because you have this 2 kilometer swath of land. And it's like, well, who controls this? Does it belong to South Korea, or does it belong to the United Nations Command Commander? Because it is the United Nations Command Commander who controls the southern part of the DMZ. And I was part of the organization that on behalf of the United Nations Command Commander would administrate everything that happened in the DMZ, in the southern half of the DMZ. So the northern half of the DMZ controlled by North Korea. Southern half of the DMZ controlled not by South Korea, but by United Nations command. Okay. So, and that's tricky. That can, there are some complexities there, just between the command and, of course, South Korea. All right. Although their residents never interact, this is the residents never interact between the two villages, Daesangdong and Kijongdong. Because one's on the southern side of the DMZ, the other's on the northern side of the DMZ. Although their residents never interact, the hope has always been that once a peace agreement is signed, these two villages might unite. The peace would spread from here. There is no fence here, only the tiny Sachon Creek. Years of fear and uncertainty keep villagers from interacting. In some cases, siblings torn apart by war live only a few miles apart. They wonder what became of their relatives and wait for the bridge to one day be open. Just north of the village and inside the actual joint security area itself, we find another crossing, the Bridge of No Return. Now, to use a name like the Bridge of No Return, if you're going to use a name that ominous, you got to be able to pull it off. So you guys tell me, is this truly a Bridge of No Return? Because that sounds like that's a pretty grandiose name. All right. So let's figure it out. The Bridge of No Return. This crossing has been popularized in films such as Salt and Die Another Day. For the United Nations Command, however, it is a sacred reminder of how quickly a place designed to seek peace can become violent. So let's understand the gravitas of the Bridge of No Return. All right. What does Sean tell us? This bridge crosses the Sachon and connects the north to the south. This crossing was the site of Operation Big Switch in the summer of 1953, and the earlier Operation Little Switch of April 1953. These events were the major repatriation operations of the Korean War, which allowed more than 100,000 prisoners of war to return to their respective nations. The operation was overseen by the United Nations Command and run by the Indian Army. The name of this crossing is apt. It was at the Bridge of No Return that each service member was given a final choice at the entrance to the bridge: stay or go. If you chose the latter, you could never return to the other side again. The crossing has seen homecomings and hard choices. It has also been the site of tragedy and high tensions. All right, let's make sure we understand what's going on here. Okay, the bridge crosses the Sachon and connects the north to the south. This crossing was the site of Operation Big Switch and Little Switch in 1953. These were major repatriation operations of the Korean War, which allowed more than 100,000 prisoners of war to return to their respective nations. So if you wanted to go home, you were taken to the bridge and you were given an opportunity to stay or go. So you can go, which would mean like return home, cross the bridge, go back to your side, return home, or you could stay. The Bridge of No Return. I think it lives up to its name. In the 23 years after the armistice signing, both the UNC and North Korea manned checkpoints at the bridge. Often called the world's loneliest outpost, U.S. and Korean People's Army, KPA. KPA means North Koreans, the North Korean Army. U.S. and KPA soldiers interacted daily here. It was often a relationship expressed in taunts and akin to bullying. All right, so for 23 years. So from 1953 for 23 years. So if you're good at your math, that's 1976, right? So from 1953 to 1976, there's some interaction here between U.S. and KPA soldiers. The aggression often led to brawls, but never escalated beyond a few broken noses. The bridge was only used once again for an exchange in 1968 when the crew of the USS Pueblo was returned from captivity at the spot. You can look up the USS Pueblo. Things changed on August 18th, 1976. Captain Arthur Boniface, I'm going to tell you now, we just mentioned before a camp called Camp Boniface. All right. Obviously named for this guy. So things changed on August 18, 1976. Captain Arthur Boniface and Lieutenant Mark Barrett traveled to the Bridge of No Return to supervise the trimming of a large tree that was obstructing important views for the United Nations Command security element. North Korean soldiers gathered in force and then attacked Boniface and Barrett, brutally killing them at the foot of the bridge. All right. So both sides would have their guard towers, right? And they would keep an eye on what's going on right there at this like key node here in the DMZ. So there was a tree that it was obstructing the view. And from, if I remember exactly correctly, and I've been up there so many times and seen where the tree used to be, but it was obstructing the view between different guard towers, so they couldn't see each other, right? So the security battalion said, hey, we got to get rid of that tree. We got to go chop it down. So they went down there to either trim the tree or take it down or whatever. And anyway, they get attacked, and Captain Boniface and Lieutenant Barrett are killed in this clash that occurs with North Korean soldiers. In 1976, the United Nations Command rejoinder to the murders was swift and heavy and pushed the Korean peninsula to the brink of war. You probably didn't know that. Under the cover of an immense show of force, the large tree was cut down without incident as President Gerald Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger monitored the North Korean response from the White House. So again, whatever you think of those guys, not necessarily our point. We're just talking about what happened and the people involved, okay, on the ground. After that day, both sides agreed that security elements from the United Nations Command and from DPRK, North Korea, would not intermingle. And the official military demarcation line, the MDL, would not be crossed without express permission from the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission. What is the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission? UNCMAC, as you know, it has been called. Well, the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission is a commission that came out of the writing of the armistice. Okay? So the armistice itself was written to include the creation of a commission on both sides that would ensure the enforcement of the armistice. Now, I know this because I worked for 2 years in the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission. Okay? So I used to go to the DMZ and I used to wear this. All right? Can you guys see that? All right, so what is this? What's this armband that we would wear when we would go to the DMZ? So you can see here. So I was the chief of operations, as you can see there. I was the chief of operations within what we would call UNCMAC, which is just a crazy, acronym meaning United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission. So you can see here, there's my name, and then under my name, you can see Military Armistice Commission. Then obviously it's just written in Korean down here below. And you can see, yeah, I'm not a fan of the United Nations. I mean, come on, I got it. But you can see here just the symbol here of United Nations because, as I explained, this was all done and is still done under the banner of the United Nations Command. Okay, so for 2 years, for 3 years, all 3 years that I was in Korea, I was part of United Nations Command. The first 2 years, I was the chief of operation for the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission. And so I've been to the DMZ many, many times. I've been to the Joint Security Area. I knew Sean when he was there, and he and I participated in kind of a little operation together that we'll get to later on in the reading. Okay. So what does UNCMAC do? UNCMAC controls everything that happens in the southern half of the DMZ. So the part of the DMZ that is controlled by the United Nations Command Commander. So it is the staff section that exists to kind of run and administrate the DMZ on behalf of the commander. And therefore, it interacts very, very closely with the security battalion that provides security right there in the Joint Security Area portion of the DMZ. So yeah, I'm very familiar with the DMZ. We would run inspections in the DMZ. I've been to many parts of the DMZ, in the far western extremes of the DMZ, the far eastern extremes of the DMZ. I've been in the joint security area many, many, many times. All right, cool. Henceforth, the bridge of no return would be manned by opposing security forces only on opposite sides of the bridge and never allowed to interact again. So, North Koreans, you stay on that side. U.S. security forces stay on this side. No interaction. And both sides agreed to this, meaning the North Koreans also agreed to this. Okay. They were like, yeah, we got it. We got it. Over the next 42 years, the United Nations Command and Korean Army security battalions never interacted directly. Okay, if you're quick with your math, over the next 42 years. So 1976 to 2018. So what he's saying is for 23 years, from 1953 until 1976, there were interactions. There were a couple brawls, a couple broken noses, nothing beyond that. In 1976, there is the incident that results in the murder of Captain Boniface and Lieutenant Barrett. Captain Boniface, or Camp Boniface is named for Captain Boniface. All right. So then no more interaction between the two sides. It's too potentially escalatory. So for 42 years, from 1976 to 2018, that's how it would be. So what would change in 2018? Good question. Glad you asked. Let's see what our friend Sean tells us. Over the next 42 years, the UNC and KPA security battalions never interacted directly. In fact, the joint security area became quite the attraction for visitors who wanted to glimpse what some call the last vestige of the Cold War. Here, U.S. and South Korean soldiers continued to face off against the North Korean soldiers just across the border. Both sides were fully armed. Both sides took the most intimidating poses they could have managed. President Bill Clinton famously described Panmunjom as the scariest place on earth after his visit. There is no doubt that the attraction to visitors was the tension and the real sense of danger. But the UNC has worked hard to maintain Panmunjom as a place for dialogue. During the time when the security forces did not interact, the UNCMAC continued to maintain contact with the KPA. Wait, hold on. You're saying the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission used to maintain contact with the Korean Army? Yes. Through daily hotline checks, United Nations Command maintained an open line for de-escalation and dialogue and provided an opportunity for the U.S. government to pursue diplomacy. There was a hotline between United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission, the organization I used to work for, and the Korean Army on the other side of the DMZ, the other side of the MDL, right? On their portion of the DMZ. Daily hotline checks. Okay? Why would you have this, why would you have this direct line? Like Sean says here, it was an open line for de-escalation and dialogue, and it provided an opportunity for the U.S. government to pursue diplomacy. Did you know that? Did you know that there was a line on opposite sides of the DMZ where the two could at least make a call and say, can you meet us for talks? Or, something like that, right? Pass a simple message. Unfortunately, in 2013, the KPA stopped answering the daily calls. Yet UNC never stopped calling. I mean, when I was there, I got there in 2017, right? This is a couple of years since they stopped answering the phone. But yes, the daily phone calls continue to occur. UNC is like, well, we're going to uphold to our end of the bargain. UNC never stopped dialing and never stopped seeking the space to pursue greater dialogue. Almost immediately after the sides agreed to prevent crossing and intermingling at the Bridge of No Return in 1976, the DPRK, North Korea, constructed another bridge to enter the joint security area. Built in only 3 days, it quickly earned the nickname of 72-hour bridge. The KPA call it the Panmunjom Bridge. The crossing also has been the scene of recent unexpected drama with potential strategic implications. All right, now, some of you will remember this, okay? The story that I'm about to tell you here, I lived it when it was happening. But many of you probably saw it on the news and you may have already forgotten about it, or if you never knew about it, you'll learn about it now. Okay, this crossing has also been the scene of recent unexpected drama with potential strategic implications. On an otherwise quiet Sunday afternoon in November 2017, KPA Sergeant Oh Chung Song drove his Army Jeep across the 72-hour bridge. All right, I'm gonna stop right there because I'm gonna tell you guys, this was over a 4-day weekend. I guess Veterans Day weekend. And I had just gotten to South Korea 2 months prior. So I was still pretty new. And I was I was checking like Facebook or something. And I would follow the English language Korean newspapers. And I happened to come across a post from like the Korea Times or Korea Herald, one of those English language newspapers. And they had just made a post like 2 minutes earlier about what we're getting ready to talk about. So it had already hit the news. And as soon as I saw it, this post, it was already in the news that it was, in an article, and that was being posted to, to like Facebook or whatever. Actually, I don't know if it was in an article yet, but it was in a post that had come across on Facebook from like the Korea Times, the Korea Herald. I read it and immediately I was like, oh, you got to be kidding me. I got to go to work. Like, I got to go to work right now. And so I checked my work phone, and sure enough, a couple of minutes before, I had gotten a phone call, which somehow I hadn't heard the phone ring. Anyway, long story short, so I, run into work and we addressed this issue. So anyway, the point is I saw a post on Facebook and immediately knew I got to go into work on I guess he said on a Sunday evening on a 4-day weekend. So on an otherwise quiet Sunday afternoon in November 2017, KPA, that's the Korean Army, North Korean Army, Sergeant Oh Chung Song drove his Army Jeep across the 72-hour bridge. Oh's North Korean Army comrades did not know why he was driving into the JSA. By the time they did realize what was happening, Oh had driven straight to the military demarcation line and crashed his Jeep into a small trench. When his fellow countrymen finally realized a defection was in progress, they started shooting. 27 shots in all. 5 of them hit their target, but O still managed to run across the border. Once the shooting stopped, the United Nations Command Security Battalion rescued O and provided him with immediate medical care. He recovered from his wounds and now lives in Seoul. It is important to note that the UNC soldiers deliberately held their fire. As they were not the targets of the North Korean Army, their mission was to defend Sergeant O once he crossed the border, but to otherwise de-escalate the situation. The DPRK, North Korea, immediately reinforced the 72-hour bridge with large mechanical gate to prevent such defections from occurring again. Tensions were high, bridges were blocked, strategic rhetoric from both sides was confrontational. The way forward looked uncertain. So I remember this. Last time I checked, I think there's a video on YouTube, so you can find there used to be. So I saw this video. So we had to investigate this. So UNCMAC investigates things that that are potential armistice violations. So I knew about this incident and we were investigating it. So, one of my colleagues was investigating this particular incident. So what happened? So this guy, Sergeant O from the North Korean Army, gets a Jeep, drives as far as he can. He crashes into a trench. He gets out. He crosses the MDL. So what has just happened? He has crossed the MDL onto the South Korean side of the DMZ. This is an act of defection. It's either an invasion or a defection. I mean, it's just one man, but you get my point. Other North Korean soldiers that are probably astonished. So they're probably like, wait, what is going on? Once they immediately realize what's happening, they open fire. They hit him 5 times. What happens to the other rounds that they fire at him but miss him with? Sean tells us there was a total of 27 rounds fired, I believe. Well, those rounds hit buildings on the southern side of the DMZ, in the joint security area. So anyway, so Sergeant O survived. He was shot 5 times. He was survived, and now lives in South Korea. So his defection was successful. Um, but yeah, I remember that. I remember seeing the footage. But that footage of him driving, it's not a very long video. It's only a couple seconds long, but you can find that on YouTube. Um, the okay, all right, got it. So that happened in November of 2018. Had the defection incident led to more KPA or UNC deaths, perhaps the newfound detente of 2018 might not have occurred. Only 6 weeks after the incident, on January 1st, 2018, North Korea's chairman, Kim Jong-un, issued his annual New Year's message to his nation. This time, the tone seemed different. I'm glad that he mentions this because I feel like nobody mentions this. People mention the warming of relations in 2018, and people neglect to mention his New Year's Day message. And I'm glad that Sean draws attention to this because this was a huge indicator that things are going to be different. Now, again, you could tell me maybe that was scripted. Listen, I'm not saying one way or the other. I have my own kind of questions about what exactly was going on with all this. But regardless, this was significant. Okay. So January 1st, Kim Jong-un issues his annual New Year's message to his nation. This time, the tone seemed different. And within the next 8 weeks, North Korea agreed to participate in the Pyeongchang Olympics. The world even saw a unified women's ice hockey team compete together. So what happened? If you remember, 2018, the Winter Olympics were held where? Pyeongchang, South Korea. So in his New Year's address to the nation, January 1st, 2018, we've just had a defection of a North Korean soldier less than 2 months earlier. But luckily, the JSA, there was not an escalation of tensions between, the security battalion and the North Korean soldiers, et cetera, even when rounds were fired by North Korean soldiers into the south side of the DMZ trying to kill the defector, which they were unsuccessful at doing. No security battalion soldiers shot back. What they did do, though, was they went and rescued Sergeant O, safely retrieved him from where he had been injured. They never fired back. They never escalated tensions. Okay. January 1st, 2018, Kim Jong-un, if I remember correctly, he congratulates South Korea on the upcoming Winter Olympics. And South Korea immediately says, oh, there's an opening here. We've got to, try to exploit this opening and re-engage in dialogue. South Korea will do that. If there is a sliver of a chance of the window of dialogue opening with North Korea, they will jump at it immediately. North Korea is not like that. But anyway, but it resulted in all of these athletes coming and participating in the Olympics. And some of these athletes from North Korea actually crossed through, South Korea or crossed through the DMZ, by land through the DMZ, into South Korea to participate in the Olympics. And you even saw an ice hockey team compete together. Huge deal. And I remember being there and personally witnessing some of the crossings in which these North Korean athletes are coming through the DMZ. And there are some land corridors that are in the DMZ that allow for land crossings, north-south through the DMZ between North and South Korea, should that be necessary. Anyway, the summit on April 27th that year between President Moon Jae-in and Chairman Kim marked a significant step towards the improvement of relations. So in the previous article that we read by Victor Cha and Andy Lin, it mentioned the potential for a new inter-Korean summit and said probably not likely. And it also mentioned an agreement that had come out of an inter-Korean summit in 2018. That's what it was referencing. So the April 27th summit was an inter-Korean summit between Chairman Kim and South Korean President Moon Jae-in. That would set the stage for Trump's visit shortly thereafter. The United Nations Command worked closely with the South Korean government to ensure the joint security area was a secure and appropriate venue for such a historic meeting. And for the first time in history, the North Korean leader walked across the border into South Korea. This is a huge deal. Now, again, scripted or not, whatever, I'm not necessarily saying one way or the other, but it's still a huge deal. And you guys can remember, you probably saw pictures of it. Trump would do the same thing. My organization, UNCMAC, and clearly the security battalion, intimately involved in prepping for these summits. Okay, there's a picture here, if you're looking at this, of demining operations in the security battalion. A lot of mines. The two leaders had multiple engagements that day, but perhaps none were as productive as when the two men shared tea alone without their entourages. This meeting, bridging regimes and nations, took place on the JSA, Joint Security Area, Blue Bridge. This humble location, affectionately nicknamed Dobodari, or Footbridge, sparked critical dialogue between the two leaders. As commander of the United Nations Command Security Battalion, from June 2018 to June 2020, I had a close-up view of how these events opened the door to increased trust and confidence between UNC and KPA soldiers in the JSA. Our increased interaction paralleled the improved dialogue and cooperation at the strategic level. The June 12th, 2018 summit in Singapore between President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim further increased opportunities for local engagement. After the summit, the security battalion in Panmunjom prepared the flags and cases to repatriate 55 sets of remains from the Korean War. The security battalion secured delivery of the materials into North Korea so the UNC, United Nations Command, remains could be flown home to Seoul and then to Hawaii with dignity and respect. Working with United Nations Command and the DPAA to fulfill a never-ending promise to keep trying to bring home our fallen comrades was a tremendous honor for the security battalion. Okay, what are we talking about here? The repatriation of remains. So when remains have been found from the war, right? You uncover remains. If those remains can be identified and you realize those remains belong to the other side, there can be a repatriation of the remains so the remains can, get to the, their families, etc. And that can happen on either side. That could be North Korean, like remains of North Korean soldiers that have been found in South Korea that are repatriated northward. It could also be remains of soldiers that belong to United Nations Command that are found in North Korea that can be repatriated southward. And then once they're in South Korea, they can be returned to the country that, that soldier belonged to. Okay. Sometimes the new atmosphere brought unique surprises. On July 12th, 2018, about 3 hours after UNCMAC had made yet another unanswered phone call on the hotline, the customary silence in the office was pierced by an old-fashioned telephone ringer. Everyone in the room looked at the phone and then at each other. Nobody had ever heard it ring before. The UNC duty officer, a flight lieutenant from New Zealand, answered the phone. Her KPA counterpart spoke as though there had not been 5 years of silence at all, informing her that he was checking the line. From then forward, as of this writing, the KPA and UNC have connected with each other twice a day. Sometimes to coordinate actions inside the demilitarized zone, and other times simply to confirm that the line is opening and someone is listening. All right. So remember, in 2013, they quit answering the phone. In 2018, they call. A trilateral turn. All right, you guys stick with me. We're about to get to some very interesting stuff. In September 2018, things began to move even more quickly in Panmunjom. President Moon and Chairman Kim signed a bilateral comprehensive military agreement. That's what was referenced in the article by Cha and Lim. That included numerous suggestions for how to leverage the joint security area as an even better venue for peace. Although the Armistice Agreement is the overarching and legally binding document that governs the demilitarized zone and the joint security area, the CMA, this comprehensive military agreement that came out of this 2018 Inter-Korean Summit, recommended measures that aligned with and advanced the goals of the Armistice Agreement. The United Nations Command supported the implementation of the CMA as a sign of its commitment to meeting armistice objectives and advancing the possibility for peace. Okay, so if you are looking at this photo, and you should be, if not, you're wrong, you're going to see here a triangular table with three sides. And then you'll see down here in the caption for the photo, it says a trilateral commission, not that trilateral commission, okay? A trilateral commission consisting of United Nations Command, ROK, Republic of Korea, which means South Korea, and DPRK, or North Korea, was created to implement a September 2018 agreement to demilitarize the JSA. All right, so trilateral commission. Who are the three sides of the commission? North Korea, South Korea, and the United States, or well, really, and United Nations Command. Not specifically the United States. It's more United Nations Command. So if you look at this photo, okay, you'll see North Koreans, South Koreans, and then this is United Nations Command. This was my boss. So he represented UNCMAC. And this is our friend Sean Morrow right here, representing the security battalion. Okay. You got some other assorted individuals probably sitting behind each leg, just taking notes or whatever. But these are the individuals that are directly participating in the commission. You got a linguist here. So anyway, that's what's happening. All right. So a trilateral commission, not that trilateral commission. Some of the key tenets in the CMA included: one, the establishment of a trilateral commission consisting of United Nations Command, Republic of Korea, that's South Korea, and DPRK, that's North Korea, to manage changes to the JSA. 2, the removal of all weapons from the JSA. 3, sharing of surveillance feeds by both sides. And 4, the establishment of joint checkpoints where United Nations Command and North Korean troops would serve side by side. What does that mean? We're going back to the pre-1976 time period, okay? All right, so this would be a significant move forward. On October 16th, 2018, all right, if you're still with me, and you should be, we're going to talk about some interesting stuff. On October 16th, 2018, the Trilateral Commission held its first meeting in the Joint Security Area. I was privileged to join the UNCMAC Secretary, Colonel Burt Hamilton, and Colonel Sean Burke of Britain at the table for negotiations. All right, that's Sean Morrow, Lieutenant Colonel, commander of the Security Battalion. That's Colonel Hamilton. He was my boss. So he would lead UNCMAC at the time. And this is Colonel Sean Burke, who was he was a British colonel, and he was also a member of United Nations Command. A schedule was proposed, and the joint demilitarization and verification was coordinated. For the next 3 weeks, the soldiers of the Security Battalion conducted extensive demining operations and prepared the heavily armed checkpoints and guard posts for the withdrawal of weapons and ultimate closure. During this time, I met and shook hands with my North Korean counterpart, a first for opposing Security Battalion commander since 1976. So what's he saying here? He met his counterpart. So he met the battalion commander on the opposing side. So the commander of the North Korean battalion that provided security for their side of the joint security area. Met him, shook his hand. That's what Sean is saying here. In mid-October, I entered North Korea with other members of the Trilateral Commission to conduct examinations of proposed locations for the joint checkpoints. I'm going to read that again. In mid-October 2018, I, meaning Sean Morrow, entered North Korea with other members of the Trilateral Commission to conduct examinations of proposed locations for the joint checkpoints. These early interactions with North Korea were professional, but they always felt scripted. I mean, I'm sure the North Koreans didn't have a lot of leeway in how they could act. After 3 weeks of demining and preparation, the United Nations Command Chief of Staff Major General Mark Minahan, stood on the military demarcation line, MDL, on October 25th, 2018, and gave the order to complete the demilitarization of the Joint Security Area. For the first time in its existence, the troops protecting Panmunjom no longer carried weapons. The guard towers now sit empty. What does that mean? We are demilitarizing the demilitarized zone, or at least the Joint Security Area, that portion of the demilitarized zone. What does that mean? Okay. In 1953, when the armistice is signed, what happens? We create this 4-kilometer buffer zone. We demilitarize it to give, a buffer between the two sides. What happens? Well, both sides start creeping forward with personnel and weapons. So what had to kind of happen is, so the demilitarized zone over time became remilitarized. So what we're saying here is it almost has to become re-demilitarized. Okay. So there were guard towers that were going to be, emptied out inside the Joint Security Area. Soldiers on both sides were not going to carry weapons, etc. Okay. Over the next 2 days, we're going to look at this photo in a moment. As part of the Trilateral Commission, I, meaning Sean Morrow, participated in a mission to inspect and verify demilitarization on both sides. The first part of the day took place in North Korea. Unsure of what to expect, we were surprised by the openness and cooperation displayed by the KPA. Everything we requested to see was shown to us, including underground tunnels, the North Korean Operations Center, and their barracks. As the hours wore on, the professional interactions led to some expected small talk. During a break, South Korean, U.S., and North Korean leaders even shared cigarettes and talked about family and common military experiences. Okay, let's look at this photo here. That's Sean Morrow, Security Battalion Commander, the guy who's writing this piece. Okay. If you've ever seen a picture of the Joint Security Area, you'll notice these blue buildings. Okay. This building, if I remember correctly, it's called Panmunjom. This is on the North Korean side of the DMZ. The person taking this photo is on the South Korean side, looking towards the North Korean side and taking the photo. This stud right here, you can't tell, but that's actually me, okay? Because I was also part of this operation. So I also was with Sean representing UNCMAC, and was part of this verification that took place on both sides of the DMZ. So the North Korean side and then also the southern side. And in fact, so that little button you can see right there is this. So we would wear this. I don't know. You probably can't see that, but anyway, it basically just says United Nations Command, and it has the, the UN logo, which I never really liked wearing because obviously I'm not a fan of the UN. But anyway, it was United Nations Command. What are you going to do? So anyway, so yes. So there are not many Americans out there who could say that they've been to North Korea, but I have been, at least onto the North Korean side of the DMZ. How far across did we go? A couple hundred yards, I'm supposing, a couple hundred meters. Like he said, we did see their operations center. We saw some of their guard posts. We saw their barracks, which was wild. I mean, I will tell you, it was the most surreal experience of my entire Army career. I mean, there were some things that I've done in Latin America that were pretty surreal, or even Afghanistan, but this probably takes the case. Like, what do you do when you wake up in a morning and you know that you're going to go to North Korea that day? You're going to go to North Korea that day. You're going to cross the NDL and go into North Korea, surrounded by North Korean soldiers for a couple hours. Now, what is the MDL? Can you see it in this photo? Yes, you can. It's this right here. Okay, so this, you got to look at the photo closely. So the MDL is a slab of concrete that is slightly raised by a few inches that runs like horizontally through this part of the joint security area. So when this photo was taken, I am assuming just based on the photo that what has happened is so in the morning, we went onto the North Korean side. We came back, and then in the afternoon, they came onto our side. So what I'm assuming is we met them at the MDL. I'm assuming this is when the photo was taken. We met them at the MDL, and then they came onto our side. And you can see this South Korean officer right here is kind of, directing them. We've probably just met them at this point, just based on the photo, and we're now bringing them onto our side. And the North Koreans are going to participate in a joint inspection of our side of the joint security area. So the southern side of the joint security area. Okay, so what does he say? Unsure of what to expect, we were surprised by the openness and cooperation displayed by the North Koreans. I totally agree. Everything we requested to see was shown to us. Totally agree. Including underground tunnels, the KPA operations center, and their barracks. Professional interactions led to small talk, cigarette break, etc. Okay, I totally agree. The next day, as the south side of the joint security area was inspected. Okay, I thought it was the afternoon of the first day, but or maybe we inspected both days. But anyway, I think that photo was them coming onto our side. We met at the MDL, they came to our side. Anyway, so on the second day, the south side of the JSA was inspected. A KPA, so a North Korean Army soldier, noticed a ramp into a building. Knocking on the ramp indicated that it had a hollow center. When they mentioned that this might be an area where newly unauthorized weapons might be concealed, we found a crowbar and offered to pry it off. This gesture satisfied their concern, and before the tool was deployed, the North Korean representatives declared, "No, stop, thank you. You don't have to tear it up, we trust you." Okay, so what just happened? So the North Koreans were with us on our side. There's a ramp, like, hey, this sounds hollow. This sounds hollow. You got something hidden in here. And immediately the security battalion commander, et cetera, was like, hey, we'll show you. We'll rip this off right now and show you there's nothing in there. Because we can always just fix the wood. It's not that big of a deal. It's much more important that you guys know that we're not trying to hide anything. That was kind of the spirit of it. And the North Koreans declined. They said, no, you're good. And that really was like kind of the spirit of the exchange. It was very, 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 very interesting for sure. The inspection moved to the bridge of no return. Remember our bridge of no return, Operation Big Switch, Little Switch. Satisfied that the old guard post was empty, the North Korean members of the party were invited to read the memorial plaque to Captain Boniface and Lieutenant Barrett. I do kind of remember this exchange. So I did not engage in any of the dialogue with the North Koreans. I was part of their group, but a lot of the dialogue was either between the senior South Korean officer and the North Korean officer, or between Lieutenant Colonel Morrow and the North Korean officer. I was there as part of the inspection party and part of the verification party. I didn't really personally engage in any of the dialogue. Okay, so now we're by the bridge of no return, and we see a memorial plaque to Captain Boniface and Lieutenant Barrett that had been murdered by the North Koreans in 1976. So the North Koreans now see this plaque that the security battalion has. So after they saw the plaque, the representatives from North Korea said it seemed to commemorate a violent event, you don't say, and perhaps should not be situated in a place of peace. The United Nations Command members politely but firmly declared it would stay, telling the North Koreans, we can move towards peace, but we must remember our history. After a long pause, North Korean colonel stated, I agree. Building trust. Over 2 days, the members of the trilateral inspection team spent about 16 hours together. Each guard post inside the joint security area was sealed jointly And the U.S., South Korean, and North Korean commanders all initialed the seals on the doors and windows. Yep, I remember all that happening. In a gesture designed to build trust and confidence, each side kept the keys to the opposite checkpoints. While all involved knew that a swift blow with a hammer is all that we needed to re-enter respective checkpoints, the gesture was important. During the months of November and December 2018, security battalion soldiers spent countless hours with North Korean counterparts in over 30 engagements. Our side always brought young soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and soldiers of every race and gender to these meetings to demonstrate what an army looks like in a democracy. We coached our troops to be tough but approachable, prepared for violence but ready to engage with kindness. I mean, that's something very interesting to have to prepare for. I mean, all I'm going to say is when we went into North Korea, I told you we were, a couple hundred meters from the DML. Like, we went through their joint security area. So all I'll say about this is we were never more than probably a couple hundred meters away from the MDL. But you're personally, and of course, you got to be prepared. If things go wrong, what do you do? Which is kind of what he's getting at here in these engagements that would happen subsequently. But, when I was there, it's kind of like, okay, if something happens, like how fast can you run a 400, like towards the NDL and get back across? Anyway, all right. So we coached our troops to be tough but approachable, prepared for violence but ready to engage with kindness. These long days led to discussions about families, growing up, education, art, and sports. We discovered that the North Korean contingent loves Frisbee and Johnny Walker. They hope their children will choose successful professions like engineering. They shared with us how they celebrate holidays. Now, were the North Koreans probably permitted to engage? I mean, did they have a script they had to follow when they were in these discussions? Who knows, right? But anyway, at the Korean New Year's holiday, I asked my counterpart across the DMZ what he planned to do. He said his wife was planning to cook a large meal for extended family, and they would follow the meal by walking through town to visit statues of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. This was a common theme during all our interactions. These men were willing to reveal their humanity, but they always ensured that we understood their commitment to the regime. I'm going to read that again. These men were willing to reveal their humanity, but they always ensured that we understood their commitment to the regime. There are a few memories I will never forget. I knew that Chairman Kim was a big fan of the Chicago Bulls teams in the 90s, so I let on early that I had grown up in Chicago and remain a basketball fanatic. They asked me numerous times about Chicago, about Michael Jordan, about the foods and cultures for which Chicago is so well known. I am certain that my love for my city made it into my targeting file, because as new Korean officers entered the mix, they would always ask me about Chicago. And if you don't think that these guys had a file on Sean Morrow, the security battalion commander on the UNC, I mean, of course they did. Once, during a particularly tricky part of construction and deforestation on the other side, we offered assistance to the North Korean troops performing the difficult tasks. They asked us why we cared so much about North Koreans. After we told them we were in this together and that our success meant greater chances for peace, an old North Korean colonel said, you are different than we were taught you would be. Now, is that also part of a scripted statement to help, almost like endear somebody on the U.S. side to a North Korean or whatever, who knows? Make you think that you're making a connection that's not really there, or that is artificial at best. Who knows? It's interesting nonetheless. As I smiled, he continued, in fact, my grandchildren are in school and they learn to count by saying 1 American bastard, 2 American bastards, 3 American bastards. I laughed, meaning Sean, and I said I hope that might change. Slowly and cautiously, both sides were building bridges. Yet some bridges remained too far to cross. Around Christmas 2018, we invited the North Koreans to share a meal with us in the historic buildings right on the military demarcation line. We sent an invitation, which they acknowledged. We never expected them to show up. But with a degree of hope on Christmas Day, we entered the blue buildings of Panmunjom. We opened the windows and the doors and laid out a feast. We waited for an hour. Eventually, 2 North Korean soldiers came down and photographed us from a distance. We left feeling dejected. A few days later, we realized that the meaning of our gesture had not been lost. Even in the absence of a meeting, trust and confidence was slowly growing. A North Korean major approached me during a meeting and said, "Thank you for inviting us to your Christmas. We wanted to come, but it wasn't possible." What now? After the concerted flurry of activity in the fall of 2018, routine interactions diminished in early 2019. Yet a palpable difference in attitude remained, whereas before 2018, every encounter at the JSA involved looking tough and posturing. The trust building from the fall of 2018 introduced an occasional wave and, if you looked close enough, a slight smile. It was clear they were not authorized to have casual conversations with us, but it was also clear that they no longer felt the need to try to intimidate us. After the Hanoi summit between President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim in February 2019, local interactions fell off even more. Tactical leaders on the North Korean side likely took their cues from their political leaders. We took our orders from our generals and continued to seek ways to build trust and confidence with the North Koreans at the tactical level. Okay, so I'm looking at a photo right now, and if you're looking at it, you can see the MDL. So you've got DPRK leader, that's North Korea. So Kim Jong-un prepares to meet President Donald Trump and South Korean President Moon Jae-in in the DMZ, June 30th, 2019. So I think earlier I said June 2018, but yeah, so June 2019. So President Trump. So right here at the MDL, which I mentioned before from the earlier photo, is just a raised slab of concrete right here. However, we all found ourselves working closely together again during a burst of activity around the spontaneous meeting between President Trump, President Moon, and Chairman Kim inside the JSA on June 30th, 2019. This time, as we secured the joint security area and observed our commander-in-chief enter North Korea, I was impressed, but not surprised, by the professionalism of the U.S. Secret Service, the South Korean Presidential Protection, and the North Korean Presidential Protection. They had a joint mission to protect their leaders, and they worked exceptionally well together. Common goals have a way of revealing common humanity. As 2019 drew to a close and 2020 entered with a storm, the emergence of African swine fever and then COVID-19 has created unexpected space between all of us, limiting both access to the JSA and interactions within it. It has been a few months now since we engaged directly with our North Korean counterparts. In the recent weeks, rhetoric from the North Koreans has once again ratcheted up. The United Nations Command remains committed to upholding the armistice agreement. The opportunity for dialogue and de-escalation, the bridge, always exists in the joint security area. Building these bridges between the United Nations Command and the North Korean soldiers creates the conditions for our generals, our diplomats, and policymakers to come to Panmunjom and safely work towards mutually beneficial policies and denuclearization, as well as the more permanent peace that has been sought since 1953. Okay. And then at the bottom here, it says Lieutenant Colonel Sean Morrow, he's now a colonel, served as the commander of the United Nations Command Security Battalion from 2018 to 2020. Morrow is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, Boston College, and the University of Chicago, where he is currently a PhD candidate in political science. I think he's completed his PhD now. He is honored to serve as the president of the West Point class of 2001. Morrow lives with his wife, Megan, and their 3 sons in West Point, New York. The opinions expressed in this paper are the author's own and do not represent the official position of the Department of Defense. And I did want to just, share that there on his behalf. Okay. Just so you guys know that is him writing that. I'm sure he had to get that article. I'm assuming he got it, kind of cleared though, just because of some of the stuff that he was talking about. But so what do we take from this? And if you listen to all that, I really appreciate it because this stuff is important. So a couple of things. So let's start back where we let's kind of end where we began. So we just had an election in South Korea. There are voices in the United States that are wary of what this will mean going forward for bilateral U.S. South Korean relationships, but also for the region. And then also just kind of amid the backdrop of potentially escalating East-West relations, writ large. And I think it's something we should look at. As I said in the beginning, hey, this is kind of a heads up, eyes on message. So let's do that. Let's look at what's going on in Korea. I'm not predicting that, North Korea is going to become the trigger for World War III. I'm not predicting that in any way. I have predicted that I do think war is coming. And I do, I said in 2025, I think we're going to see them set the stage for war. I stand by that prediction. And I also think that is occurring. Do I think that what's happening in Korea is related to the escalation in tensions? I don't know. I'm not necessarily predicting that. But I am saying we should watch what's happening. But aside from that, aside from whatever is happening with the South Korean elections, much more broadly, it's important for us just to know what's going on in Korea. Because it is an extremely interesting place geostrategically. And I wanted to share some of this today because I know that a lot of Americans are not exactly aware of how the Koreas became to be split, or what exactly is the DMZ. People hear about it, but what exactly is it? And I know that almost nobody is aware of some of those things that happened along the DMZ, which are super, super, super important, even if scripted. They're super, super, super important. And they also give us a glimpse into the humanity of very real people. Because I'm going to share a secret with you. Even North Koreans are people. Okay. And we can't lose sight of someone's humanity, even if they're from a country that our government would consider to be an enemy. So that's kind of my message. I appreciate you sticking with me. If you did stick with me, then, leave me a comment. So let me know, did you learn something you did not know about Korea, whether it's South Korea, whether it's North Korea, whether it's about the DMZ? Let me know. Let me know if you learned something that you did not know. And I hope it gives you a broader perspective, not just on geopolitics or potential geostrategic flashpoints, but just about, humanity in general. Because I am someone who believes that you must understand who your enemies are, and you should be prepared to oppose them. But even in doing so, you should never lose sight of the fact that even your enemy is also a human being. And your enemy today doesn't necessarily have to remain your enemy. And even as I share this, I'm not even necessarily just talking about North Koreans. Okay. All right. Hey, appreciate that. And I hope you learned something. And if you did, or even if you didn't, let me know in the comments below.